Margaret Williams woke up on her 67th birthday with a flutter of excitement she hadn't felt in years. Sunlight streamed through her bedroom curtains as she stretched, imagining the evening ahead. Today would be different. Today, her 3 children would finally show her the love and appreciation she'd been waiting for. She spent the entire morning in the kitchen, her hands working with practiced precision. The roast beef, David's favorite, went into the oven first. Sarah's beloved lemon cake followed, the same recipe Margaret had perfected over 30 years of birthdays and celebrations. For Michael, she prepared his childhood comfort food, garlic mashed potatoes that used to make him smile when he was small and heartbroken. The dining room table gleamed under her grandmother's crystal chandelier. Margaret had set out the good china, the silverware she'd saved for special occasions, and fresh flowers from her garden. Everything perfect, everything ready for her children to walk through that door and remind her that all those years of sacrifice had been worth it. By 6 o'clock, they arrived within minutes of each other, as if they'd coordinated their timing. David, her eldest at 42, walked in checking his phone. Sarah, 39, barely looked up from texting. Michael, the baby at 35, seemed distracted, already glancing at his watch. "Happy birthday, Mom," they said in unison, their voices carrying the enthusiasm of a grocery store greeting. Then came the gifts. 3 identical packages, hastily wrapped in drugstore paper. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she opened the first one. Socks, plain, white, $3 socks from the pharmacy down the street. The second package, identical socks. The third, the same. "Thanks, kids," Margaret whispered, forcing a smile that felt like breaking glass. But what shattered her heart completely was overhearing their conversation during dinner. David bragged about his new $60,000 BMW. Sarah showed off her designer handbag that cost more than Margaret's monthly grocery budget. Michael discussed his upcoming vacation to Europe, laughing about spending $5,000 on hotels alone. Meanwhile, Margaret's birthday gifts, $9 worth of socks, sat forgotten on the kitchen counter. As her children barely touched the meal she'd spent hours preparing, Margaret felt something crack inside her chest. It wasn't her heart breaking, it was her illusions finally shattering, revealing a truth she'd been too loving to see. Her children saw her as an obligation, not their mother. That night, Margaret sat alone in her darkened living room, the cheap socks still clutched in her hands. The silence felt deafening after years of filling every quiet moment with thoughts of her children's happiness. Now, in the stillness, memories came flooding back like a dam bursting open. She remembered the day everything changed, 42 years ago, when the police officer stood at her door with his hat in his hands, telling her that Robert, her beloved husband, her children's father, had been killed in a car accident. David was only 8, Sarah 6, and little Michael just 3 years old. 3 babies who suddenly had only her. Margaret had been a promising high school English teacher then, just 5 years into what everyone said would be a brilliant career. Her principal had pulled her aside weeks before Robert's death, offering her the department head position. "You have such a gift with these kids, Margaret," he'd said. "You could change so many lives." Instead, she changed diapers, made lunchboxes, and worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. She remembered selling her engagement ring, the one Robert had saved for 6 months to buy to pay for David's college application fees. She'd driven to the pawn shop with tears streaming down her face, telling herself it was just a piece of metal compared to her son's future. When Sarah needed money for her sorority, Margaret had sold her grandmother's pearl necklace, the only valuable thing her family had passed down. "Education is more important than jewelry," she'd whispered to herself, even as her heart ached watching a stranger walk away with her most precious heirloom. For Michael's graduate school, she'd taken a second mortgage on the house, working double shifts at the diner while her contemporaries were advancing in their careers, traveling, living their dreams. She remembered the countless nights she'd sat at this same kitchen table, paying bills by candlelight because the electricity had been shut off, making sure her children never knew how close they'd come to losing everything. She'd worn the same winter coat for 15 years, darned holes in her stockings, and eaten peanut butter sandwiches for dinner so her kids could have meat with their meals. Every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone had been about them. She'd thrown elaborate parties she couldn't afford, bought gifts that required her to skip meals, and smiled through her exhaustion because their happiness was her purpose. Now, They couldn't even be bothered to spend more than $3 on her birthday. The woman who had given up everything for her children had become invisible to the very people she'd sacrificed everything to raise. Margaret's painful reverie was interrupted by the sound of chairs scraping against the dining room floor. She quickly wiped her eyes and returned to find her children already standing, checking their phones and reaching for their coats. "Sorry, Mom, but I need to head out," David announced, not even looking at her. "Jennifer's expecting me at her parents' house by 8. You know how she gets when I'm late." Sarah was already slipping on her designer jacket. "Yeah, I've got plans to. The girls are meeting for drinks at that new rooftop place downtown. Thanks for dinner, though." Michael kissed her cheek with the mechanical affection of a stranger. "Great meal, Mom. I'm meeting some friends at the sports bar to watch the game. You understand, right?" Margaret stood frozen as her children filed toward the front door, leaving behind plates of barely touched food and a table set with love they couldn't be bothered to acknowledge. The lemon cake sat untouched, its carefully piped frosting flowers wilting under the dining room lights. "Drive safely," she managed to whisper, but they were already gone. Margaret began clearing the table, her movements slow and mechanical. As she scraped their leftover dinners into the garbage disposal, she heard voices from the driveway. Her children hadn't left yet. They were standing by their cars, talking. Curiosity drew her to the front window, where she pulled back the curtain just enough to see them. What she heard next would haunt her forever. $3 socks from the pharmacy. David laughed, shaking his head. "Honestly, what does she expect? It's not like she's going anywhere fancy." Sarah giggled, a sound that used to bring Margaret such joy. "I know, right? I mean, they're just socks. Good enough for someone who sits around the house all day." "At least we showed up," Michael added, jingling his car keys. "That's more than most people would do." But it was David's next words that stopped Margaret's heart cold. "Honestly, I can't wait for this whole charade to be over. Once she's gone, we can finally sell this house and split the money. Jennifer's already picked out the vacation home we want to buy with my share." Sarah nodded eagerly. "I've got my eye on a condo downtown. Mom's always going on about how this place will be ours someday. Well, someday can't come fast enough. The sooner the better," Michael agreed. "I love her, but let's be real, she's become kind of a burden. All these family dinners and guilt trips about visiting more often." Margaret's legs gave out. She sank onto the hallway floor, her back against the wall, as her children's laughter echoed in the night air. They weren't just ungrateful, they were actively waiting for her to die. The birthday gifts hadn't been thoughtless. They'd been insulting, intentionally cruel. Margaret remained on the hallway floor long after her children's car engines faded into the night. When she finally found the strength to stand, something fundamental had shifted inside her. The loving mother who had spent 40 years making excuses for her children's behavior was gone, replaced by a woman who finally saw the truth with crystal clarity. She walked slowly to her study, a small room her children had never bothered to explore. To them, it was just where Mom kept her old teaching stuff. They had no idea what really lived behind that locked oak desk drawer. Margaret's hands trembled as she retrieved this small brass key from behind her late husband's photograph. She'd hidden it there for over 2 decades, knowing that Robert's picture was the one place her children would never think to look. They'd stopped asking about their father years ago. The drawer opened with a soft click, revealing a world her children never knew existed. Manila folders lined the interior, each one labeled with meticulous handwriting. Investment portfolio, mutual funds, real estate holdings, stock certificates, banking, high-yield savings. Margaret pulled out the first folder with reverent care. Inside were documents that told a very different story than the one her children believed. When Robert died, his life insurance payout had been substantial, $200,000. But instead of spending it on immediate needs, Margaret had done something her children assumed she was too simple to understand. She'd invested it. While working those multiple jobs and living paycheck to paycheck, she'd quietly funneled every spare dollar into carefully researched investments. The night janitor position at the bank had taught her more about finance than any college course could have. She'd listened to conversations, picked up discarded investment reports, and educated herself about the market during those long, lonely hours. The mutual funds folder revealed a portfolio worth over $800,000. Conservative investments, steady growth, reinvested dividends, all managed by Margaret herself through decades of disciplined saving. But that was just the beginning. The real estate folder contained deeds to 4 rental properties across the county. That teaching conference she'd attended every few months for the past 15 years, she'd actually been managing her rental portfolio, collecting rent, and reinvesting the profits. The properties were now worth over $900,000 combined. Her stock portfolio held another $600,000 in blue-chip companies she'd researched meticulously. Every birthday check her children hadn't bothered to send, every Christmas gift they'd forgotten, every Mother's Day they'd ignored. She'd taken that emotional energy and channeled it into building wealth they couldn't imagine. Margaret spread the documents across her desk like a general reviewing battle plans. Her total net worth, $2.3 million. She lived in a paid-off house worth $400,000, drove a modest car she owned outright, and maintained a lifestyle that cost her less than $40,000 a year. Her children thought they were waiting to inherit a simple teacher's pension and a small suburban home. They had no idea they'd just insulted a millionaire who had planned to leave them everything. Margaret smiled for the first time that day, but it wasn't the warm, maternal smile her children remembered. It was the smile of a woman who had just decided to change everything. Margaret reached for her phone with steady hands. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she needed. James Patterson, attorney at law. James had been Robert's law school roommate and had handled every legal matter for the Williams family for over 30 years. More importantly, he was one of the few people who knew the true extent of Margaret's wealth. "James, it's Margaret Williams. I know it's late, but I need you to come over tonight. It's urgent." "Margaret, is everything all right? You sound different." "Everything is finally clear. Can you come? I need to change my will." There was a pause. James had helped Margaret draft her current will 5 years ago, leaving everything to her 3 children in equal shares. "Are you sure this can't wait until morning? These decisions shouldn't be made in haste. James, I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Please." 30 minutes later, James sat across from Margaret in her living room, his briefcase open and his expression concerned. He'd known Margaret for decades, had watched her struggle through widowhood and sacrifice everything for her children. He'd never seen her like this calm, determined, and completely resolute. "Tell me what happened," he said gently. Margaret recounted the evening's events with surgical precision, the thoughtless gifts, the overheard conversation, the cruel laughter about her death being a financial windfall. James listened without interruption, his expression growing more troubled with each detail. "Margaret, I understand you're hurt, but completely disinheriting your children is exactly what they deserve," she interrupted. "James, they don't love me. They tolerate me while they wait for me to die. Tonight proved that." Margaret pulled out a legal pad where she'd already outlined her new wishes. "I want to divide my estate as follows. $500,000 to Maria Santos, my housekeeper. She's been more of a daughter to me than my own children. Another $500,000 to establish the Robert Williams Memorial Scholarship Fund for underprivileged students' children who actually value education." James scribbled notes, his pen moving reluctantly across the paper. $400,000 split equally between St. Mary's Children's Hospital and the local food bank. $300,000 to the literacy program at the public library. Another $300,000 to fund free tutoring programs for struggling students. The remaining amount in my house can go to Habitat for Humanity. "And your children," Margaret's voice was ice. "They each get a pair of socks, the same cheap socks they gave me tonight. Let them inherit exactly what they thought I was worth." James set down his pen. "Margaret, sleep on this. In the morning, I'll feel exactly the same way. James, I spent 40 years putting my children first. Tonight, I learned that in their eyes, I'm nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle to their inheritance. Well, now they'll discover that obstacle was the only thing standing between them and poverty." James studied his old friend's face and recognized something he'd seen in countless clients over the years, the absolute certainty of someone who had finally seen the truth. "All right, Margaret, let's draft your new will over the next 6 weeks." Margaret threw herself into her new mission with the same dedication she'd once reserved for her children's needs. Every morning brought fresh purpose as she systematically built a legacy that would honor the values her children had forgotten. Her first meeting was with Dr. Patricia Chen, director of St. Mary's Children's Hospital. Margaret sat in the sterile conference room, watching the administrator's eyes widen as she explained her donation plans. $400,000 would fund our pediatric wing expansion for the next decade, Dr. Chen said, barely containing her excitement. "Mrs. Williams, this would help thousands of children who deserve love and care." Margaret replied quietly. Unlike some I know, the scholarship fund required more intricate planning. Margaret met with her former teaching colleagues at the high school, explaining her vision for the Robert Williams Memorial Fund. She wanted it to help students like she'd once been, smart kids from poor families who needed someone to believe in their potential. We'll focus on first-generation college students, she told the scholarship committee. Kids whose parents never had the opportunity for higher education but who dream of something better. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was funding strangers' children, while her own had written her off as worthless. Margaret's most emotional meeting was with Maria Santos, her housekeeper of 15 years. Maria had immigrated from El Salvador and cleaned Margaret's house twice a week while studying English at night and raising 2 children as a single mother. She'd been the one to bring Margaret soup when she was sick, to listen to her worries, to remember her birthday with a hand-picked bouquet from her own garden. "Senora Margaret, I don't understand," Maria said, tears streaming down her face as Margaret explained the inheritance. "This is too much. Your children, my children, have made their feelings clear," Margaret said firmly. "You've been more of a daughter to me than they ever were. You've earned this, Maria. Use it to secure your family's future." Meanwhile, Margaret's biological children continued proving her decision was right. David canceled their weekly lunch 3 times in a row, always with some excuse about work or Jennifer's social obligations. Sarah called only when she needed Margaret to babysit her neighbor's dog during a weekend trip. Michael's sole communication was a text asking if she could loan him money for a new golf club membership. Margaret began keeping a journal, documenting every missed call, every broken promise, every moment they treated her as an afterthought. Each entry strengthened her resolve like steel tempering in fire. The most telling incident came when Margaret mentioned feeling unwell during a brief phone call with Sarah. Instead of concern, her daughter's response was immediate irritation. "Mom, you can't be sick right now. I've got that charity gala next week, and I told everyone how great you look for your age. Don't embarrass me by showing up looking frail." Margaret hung up the phone and made another journal entry. Sarah more concerned about her social image than her mother's health. This confirms everything. As autumn approached, Margaret's new will was finalized, notarized, and secured. Her charitable meetings were complete, her beneficiaries chosen with care. She'd built something beautiful from the ashes of her shattered illusions. Now all that remained was waiting. The chest pain hit Margaret on a Tuesday morning while she was watering her roses, sharp, radiating discomfort that sent her to her knees in the garden, gasping for breath. Maria found her there 20 minutes later and immediately called an ambulance, riding alongside Margaret to the hospital while frantically trying to reach her children. The emergency room diagnosis was a minor heart episode, stress-induced, the cardiologist explained, but serious enough to warrant a 3-day observation period. Margaret lay in the sterile hospital bed, connected to monitors that beeped steadily, reflecting the rhythm of a heart that had been broken too many times. Her children arrived within hours, and for a brief moment, Margaret felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this scare would remind them of what truly mattered. Maybe they'd remember that beneath their financial expectations lived a woman who had loved them unconditionally. That hope died quickly. "How long do they expect her to be here?" David whispered to Sarah, clearly assuming Margaret was unconscious from the mild sedatives. "I've got that business trip to Chicago on Thursday. The doctor said 3 days, maybe 4. Sarah replied, scrolling through her phone. "Jennifer's probably freaking out about you missing her mother's anniversary party." Margaret kept her eyes closed and her breathing steady, a skill she'd perfected during years of pretending not to hear her children's harsh words about her cooking, her clothes, her old-fashioned ways. "Well, at least if something happens, we won't have to plan anything elaborate," Michael said, settling into the uncomfortable visitor's chair. "I mean, she's never been one for big ceremonies. Simple funeral, divide up the house contents, put it on the market." Margaret's heart monitor registered a slight increase in rhythm, but her children were too absorbed in their conversation to notice. "I've always wanted Mom's bedroom," Sarah announced. "It has the best natural light, and I could turn it into a home office. David, you can have the master bathroom renovated. That vintage tile is hideous. Anyway, I'm claiming the basement," Michael added. "Perfect man cave potential. We'll need to gut the whole first floor though. Mom's decorating is so dated." David nodded thoughtfully. "Jennifer's already got a realtor in mind. She says houses like this are selling fast in today's market. We could probably get 450, maybe 500 if we stage it right. Split 3 ways." That's still a decent chunk of change, Sarah calculated aloud. Plus, whatever's in her savings account. She always acted like money was tight. But teachers' pensions aren't terrible. Margaret nearly laughed at their ignorance. If they only knew they were casually discussing the distribution of pennies, while millions sat in accounts they'd never dreamed existed. Should we call Jennifer's contractor for estimates? Michael asked. Get a head start on the renovation plans. Let's wait until she's actually gone, David said with practiced pragmatism. No point counting chickens before they hatch. That phrase one Margaret had used throughout their childhoods to teach them. Patience and humility now became the epitome of their callousness. They weren't just waiting for her to die, they were actively planning for it. When they finally left that evening, each claiming urgent obligations that prevented them from staying longer, Margaret made a decision. She asked for paper and pen from the night nurse. The next morning, she called James. I need to add one final element to my plan, she told him, a video message. They deserve to know exactly why they're getting nothing. Her legacy would include not just justice, but the truth they'd spent years avoiding. 6 months later, Margaret Williams passed peacefully in her sleep on a quiet Sunday morning. Maria found her with a serene expression, as if she'd finally found the peace that had eluded her in her final years with her children. The funeral was small but meaningful. Maria James, several former teaching colleagues, and representatives from the charities Margaret had so generously supported. Her children attended, of course, dressed in appropriately somber clothing and wearing expressions of practiced grief. The following Tuesday, David, Sarah, and Michael sat in James Patterson's law office, their anticipation barely concealed beneath their mourning facade. They'd spent the past few days making preliminary arrangements, confident that their mother's estate would fund the new lives they'd already begun planning. Thank you all for coming, James began, his voice carefully neutral. Before we proceed with the reading of your mother's will, she left specific instructions that you watch this video message first. The siblings exchanged glances. A video seemed unnecessarily dramatic for what they assumed would be a straightforward inheritance proceeding. But they nodded their agreement. James pressed play on his laptop, and Margaret's face filled the screen. She looked directly into the camera, with the calm dignity they'd never bothered to notice in life. Hello, David, Sarah, and Michael. If you're watching this, then I'm gone, and you're sitting in James's office expecting to inherit my estate. I imagine you're already calculating how to spend what you think I've left you. Margaret paused, her eyes holding a glimmer of the woman who had once commanded respect in every classroom she'd entered. I want you to know that I recorded this message 6 months ago, after spending an evening in the hospital listening to you plan my funeral and discuss renovating your house while you thought I was unconscious. It was the final confirmation of something I'd suspected for years, that you stopped seeing me as your mother long ago. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair. David's confident expression began to waver. You reduced my worth to $3, 3 pairs of pharmacy socks on my 67th birthday, while you bragged about spending thousands on yourselves. But more than that, you sat in my driveway and laughed about waiting for me to die so you could claim your inheritance. Margaret's voice remained steady, but her disappointment was unmistakable. So I've decided to give you exactly what you gave me. Nothing more, nothing less. James reached into his desk drawer and withdrew 3 small packages, each wrapped in the same drugstore paper from that fateful birthday. Each of you will receive 1 pair of socks, the same socks you gave me. They represent the value you placed on our relationship. Inside each package, you'll also find a letter explaining my final decision. The siblings stared at the packages as if they were venomous snakes. Margaret's video continued. I want you to understand that this isn't about money. It's about love, respect, and recognizing that the woman who sacrificed everything for you deserved better than to be treated as an inconvenience. Her expression softened slightly, showing a glimpse of the mother they'd once known. I hope someday you'll learn to value the people in your lives before it's too late. That's the only inheritance that truly matters. The screen went black. James cleared his throat. Now, shall we proceed with the actual reading of the will? James opened the formal will document, his expression grave. The Williams children sat in stunned silence, still clutching their packages of socks, waiting for what they assumed would be the real inheritance discussion. I, Margaret Elizabeth Williams, being of sound mind and body, do hereby distribute my estate as follows. James began reading in his formal attorney voice. David leaned forward expectantly. Sarah smoothed her skirt, already mentally redecorating her future home office. Michael checked his phone, probably calculating mortgage payments. To Maria Santos, who has been the daughter I needed when my own children forgot how to love, I leave the sum of $500,000 and the contents of my jewelry box, so she may always remember that kindness is the most precious treasure. The room fell silent except for Maria's sharp intake of breath. She sat in the back corner, tears streaming down her face as she pressed her hands to her mouth. Margaret's children whipped around to stare at their mother's housekeeper. 500,000. Their mother had that kind of money. James continued without pause. To the Robert Williams Memorial Scholarship Fund, established in memory of my late husband who believed education could change the world, I leave $500,000 to help deserving students achieve their dreams. Wait, David interrupted, his voice strangled. How much money did our mother have? James ignored the question and kept reading. To St. Mary's Children's Hospital, I leave $200,000 for their pediatric wing expansion, so that sick children might receive the care and compassion every child deserves. Sarah's face had gone pale. This can't be right. Mom was a teacher. She lived modestly. She to the Riverside County Food Bank. I leave $200,000. Because no child should go hungry while others waste resources on luxury. Michael's mouth hung open as the numbers continued climbing. To the Public Library Literacy Program, I leave $300,000 to fund free tutoring for struggling students. To Habitat for Humanity, I leave my house at 1247 Maple Street, valued at $400,000, along with $300,000 to help build homes for families who understand that a house becomes a home through love, not inheritance expectations. The attorney looked up at the three stunned siblings. Your mother's total estate was valued at $2.3 million. David shot to his feet. $2.3 million. How is that possible? She was just a teacher. She was a brilliant woman who invested wisely while living within her means. James replied coldly, something you might have discovered if you'd ever bothered to have a real conversation with her. Dr. Patricia Chen from the Children's Hospital stepped forward with tears in her eyes. Mrs. Williams, your mother's generosity will save hundreds of children's lives. She was an extraordinary woman. The scholarship committee representative nodded in agreement. The Robert Williams Memorial Fund will help dozens of students every year. Her legacy will live on through every life she touches. Maria approached the siblings, her voice thick with emotion. Your mother, she was so proud of you always. She showed me your pictures, talked about your achievements. But she was so lonely, so hurt that you never called just to ask how she was feeling. Margaret's final video message played in the background. As James concluded the will reading, I've given you the most valuable gift possible, the truth about what matters. Money comes and goes, but love and respect, once lost, can never be bought back. Learn from this, my children. It's not too late to become the people I once believed you could be. The charity's representatives embraced each other and Maria, celebrating lives that would be changed forever. Margaret's children sat in their chairs, surrounded by grateful strangers, finally understanding what they had lost. 6 months after the will reading, the Williams siblings found themselves forever changed by their mother's final lesson. David and Sarah remained bitter, their marriages strained by the financial reality that their expected windfall would never come. They sold their expensive possessions and downsized their lifestyles. But the deeper wound understanding how they'd failed as children remained unhealed. Michael, however, chose a different path. He found himself drawn to the Robert Williams Memorial Scholarship Program, initially driven by curiosity about where his inheritance had gone. What he discovered there transformed him completely. He met Maria, who now served on the scholarship committee, reviewing applications from students whose stories mirrored his mother's own childhood struggles. Your mother, she would sit here and read every application herself, Maria told him, showing him Margaret's handwritten notes in the margins of student essays. She looked for the hungry ones, not hungry for food, but hungry for knowledge, for a chance. Michael began volunteering with the program, reading the essays his mother had once reviewed. He saw his own children differently now, understanding that love wasn't measured in dollars spent but in moments shared, conversations remembered, presents offered freely. The scholarship recipients never knew their benefactor personally, but Margaret's influence touched each of their lives. Jenny Rodriguez, the first recipient, became a pediatric nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, where Margaret's donation had funded her treatment as a child. Tommy Chen used his scholarship to become a teacher, inspired by the anonymous woman who'd believed in education's power to transform lives. At the hospital, Margaret's donation created the Williams Family Pediatric Wing, where sick children received care funded by a grandmother whose own grandchildren barely knew her name. The food bank served thousands of meals purchased with Margaret's generosity, each one a testament to her belief that love should nourish, not starve. Meanwhile, Maria used her inheritance to buy a small house and put her children through college. She kept Margaret's jewelry box on her dresser, not for its monetary value, but as a reminder that true wealth comes from treasuring the people who treasure you. Margaret's final lesson echoed through every life she'd touched. Love and respect cannot be inherited, like money or property. They must be given freely, nurtured carefully, and honored daily. Her children had learned too late that the woman they'd dismissed as worthless had been rich in all the ways that truly mattered. Margaret Williams left behind a legacy more valuable than millions. She'd shown that sometimes the greatest act of love is teaching people what love actually means. In the end, Margaret's revenge had been perfect justice. She'd given everyone exactly what they deserved.